Okay. Does it say that I'm recording right now? I think it should be. Okay. All right. Well, in any event, same submission format as homework 1. You'll have a minute of audio, and I have 4 screenshots for you. And one of them is a sample that you got from the internet with a description of what you did, and ideally you'd use the Soundflower or VB cable setup, but other sources are acceptable if you're having difficulties. I was able to help someone over Zoom get VB cable working, and in fact, they were able to have it running while Zoom was running. So actually, there's not you can actually use it at the same time, which was surprising. So if that's something you're interested in doing, it's not so daunting. The differences in how to get it set up are slightly different than what I have on the OneNote. It's actually easier. I don't have a machine handy right now where I could do a screenshot of how it looks on Windows 10, but some descriptions were kind of provided by some students. In terms of, let me see, sorry, my mouse just got disconnected. Let's see. Charged it all last night, so this wouldn't happen, but let's see. Anything? Let's see. Okay, great. So, oops. Huh. Oops. It's telling me when my mouse is off. Come on. Okay, great, awesome. So what I was really kind of getting at was this workflow. When you're recording for Windows, all these ACO for all steps are the same, but this looks a little different. On Windows, I believe if you just right-click this icon and you go to sound settings or playback devices, you'll see a different screen than this. But all you have to do is just change the output from your default speakers to this. It'll just look like a Windows 10 version sort of thing. This step is kind of tricky. When you work on this step, you want to make sure you collapse everything. You uncollapse everything. So like all of these little like drop downs, like uncollapse them all, like turn everything off, and then make sure that you only have one output selected and one input selected. Because remember, the virtual audio is going from like your computer into ACO for all, and then ACO for all is outputting to your computer speakers. So you want exactly one input and exactly one output. So if anyone has any questions on that, I'm happy to assist them. It's not so bad. Luckily, I was able to diagnose it with a student. It worked fine. So anyway, geez, my mouse keeps logging out. Let's see. This is, okay, great. So the other thing to say is I just want you to start working with chopping up samples. So in arrangement view, you could, we kind of talked about how you can take a sample and you can kind of reverse it. You can kind of take it into smaller sections. You could use the different warp algorithms to get different results depending on what you're trying to do. And the next thing I want you to do is to take a screenshot of Simpler's device controls with something that you've tweaked, because this is sort of a foray into synthesis, and we're going to talk about more applications for these elements of synthesis. If you understand them correctly, you can apply them. It's holistic, really, because there's so many different ways you can apply envelopes and LFOs, but if you learn how to use it in one paradigm, the good news is it's not too difficult to pick up in another paradigm. And lastly, I would like a screenshot of you having played around with warp markers and a description for what you did. Happy to go over this stuff again to some degree in the context of a track that we can kind of work on together as a class. it takes a little bit of repetition to get used to it. But just kind of, it might be a good idea just to kind of do a little review of parts 2, 3, and 4, just in case you're unfamiliar. So if you're chopping up a sample, if I go into samples, for instance, and I grab a sample, okay, I think I know what I need to share a computer sound. Okay. Ooh, my mouse is really laggy right now. Okay. Sorry, give me one sec, guys. I'm trying to figure. Oh. Maybe this will help. Let's see. Okay. Okay, so if I've got a particular sample like this, let's find like a drum sample. Maybe I'll look up a drum sample. Of course, you might not have all these samples on your machine because I've got a professional version of Ableton, and I think you guys do too. But I've got like all the sample packs that they provided to me as well, which are a little more difficult to get on your machine unless you bought it outright. Cool, a little breakbeat. So for instance, this is a great, whoops, I want to drag this onto an audio track, right? So I'll drag this onto an audio track. And then what I have really is a breakbeat. This is really great. Ideally, I'd put them lined up with the beginning of a bar, right? Measure 5, right? Breakbeats are meant to be broken. They're meant to be kind of chopped up and sliced and iterated over. So for instance, you see this. You could do something like this. You could chop it up by doing something like this. I could either select a region and press Command D. Ooh, that's not going to work. Command O. That's not going to work. I'm in automation mode right now. That's why none of this is working. So I've got to exit automation mode. Now I could select a region, duplicate stuff. Right? So this is just kind of breaking up that breakbeat, right? To kind of review a little bit, you can transpose. If you do a little repetition, sometimes it's nice to change the pitch over time. So I'll do -2 semitones for the first repetition, -4 semitones for the second repetition. Again, I'm in the clip view to access these parameters, right? There's no device because it's just an audio clip. Maybe the fourth iteration, I'll do -6 semitones. Let's see how that sounds. It sounds like there's kind of like a tape stopping effect or some sort of brokenness. But this is an example of how you can chop up an audio sample. To kind of review a little bit more, if you click a particular clip and you go back to the clip view for that clip, you can reverse the sample. Right? You can do stuff like that. Here's a good application, actually. A reverse cymbal is something I do a lot. So a reverse cymbal, I have this like little 80s groove that I have going on. Turn off my vocals. I don't know where. Oh, you know what? I turn off the arpeggiator. So I have an arpeggiator as well. So I was trying to mess around with this sound, and I think I ruined it. Little arpeggiator. Before class, I must have messed this thing up because some of those notes are missing, but that's okay. What I was getting at with a reverse cymbal, it's kind of a really effective thing to incorporate at new sections. So for instance, let's say I have this particular loop, right? I have this sort of thing, and maybe I'll try to make it sound a little better. I've got some vocals that are too shy to share. It's just gibberish vocals. What I like to do is after a section repeats, like let's say the section repeats. Oh, I know what's going on. I changed the wave type from sine to, it was square wave before. So one thing I like doing is I like taking a cymbal sound and reversing it. Because one thing that is useful, I think I've talked about different aspects of music theory that are useful for a composition setting. I've talked about, you know, bass, you have a chordal instrument. I have all those things. I have drums. I have a melodic instrument through my voice, which is just saying gibberish right now. Placeholder lyrics, because I haven't thought of lyrics. Then effects are also important. So like filter sweeps we've talked about, right? That was one of your assignments, I think, for portions of assignment 1, I believe, to demonstrate automation. And I think a lot of you might have automated a filter to create a filter sweep. No, that's not a filter sweep. That's a reverse cymbal. A filter sweep is like cutting out all of the sound basically and introducing some of it over time. But taking a cymbal sound and reversing it kind of is cool to usher in a new section. So for instance, I have this 4-bar loop, but I'll take a cymbal, just any cymbal. So I'll take that little cymbal, and what I'll do is I'll put it over here. And then, well, this is really long actually. So I'll take it. There's a lot of symbolism in this, guys. I'm just kidding. No, there's just a lot of symbols. All right. So I'll take this cymbal. I'll put it over here. A boring cymbal. Well, that's their opinion. And then I'll reverse the cymbal. And what I'll get is this sort of sweeping effect. Ooh, that's super loud. I'm sorry, guys. So this is often what happens. Cymbals, sometimes these cymbals come in a little hot. So I'm going to lower the volume. But you can kind of see how this is, what's going to happen right here, right? It creates a nice little ushering. So this is an example of using an audio clip, reversing it, and you get something kind of cool. And sometimes it's nice to actually add a cymbal on the downbeat of the next beat as well, or something kind of splashy. And you know, you can kind of adjust the volume accordingly so that it's... That didn't quite work. Maybe I'll transpose it. Right? So it's sort of it's a cool effect. And this is an example of using a clip, and something I do all the time, because when I have a composition, I structure it, especially a composition like this where I anticipate repetition. I try to make the repetition more engaging by introducing something quirky or something new at every single instance of the repetition. It might be like a guitar, or it might be me singing something new. It might be a slight variation in the bass line. It might be something. But I like doing that. And so this, for instance, this is the entire progression of this section. I might add other harmonic sections later, probably will, but this is one section. I want to perhaps accentuate the coming of this section each time so that it, you know, the listener enjoys the repetition. We want to kind of massage the repetition into them so it's more evident that, oh, this is repeating. This is like the new chord progression that I'm familiar with. So
hey,
this
Professor,
is, yeah.
I have a question about the volume. So what's the difference between changing the volume on the mixer and changing it on like the dial you did? I know it like decreases the fatness of it, but like what's like the real sounding difference?
There's actually, there's no different, it's really a matter of preference. You can adjust, so for instance, if you're coming from Pro Tools, it also has the capability for allowing you to adjust the clip gain, and it has the capability for you allowing you to adjust the track gain. But what
I think I know what one difference might be, is that if you have, like, if you raise it on the track, then any audio sample on the track is going to be raised. Whereas if you just raise the clip, just that individual clip on the track is raised, right?
That's absolutely true. So you could, yeah, no, that is true. But if you did draw an automation, like let's say you wanted to draw in automation, you could conceivably do something like this, where you're like, I want this particular part to be softer. I want this particular part to be louder. But let me undo that. But you know what's nice about clip gain is it gives you a visual feedback for how loud the clip is. In fact, in Pro Tools and Logic, I think you can actually automate clip gain. And I actually put a feature request in Ableton for this request because personally I prefer clip gain. I wish I could just keep automating this and it's like Chris said, you can do it on an individual basis, and it's more flexible that way in that regard. Whereas, you know, if you automate things using the volume fader, it's traditionally a lot of softwares, except Ableton doesn't have this so nicely baked into it. Like for instance, I have faders on my desk. You could adjust the faders and they would just change over time. So I guess it's just a completely different workflow altogether. Like clip gain is like newer. Like in the old days, like people would only have access to the fader where they would just have to like do micro adjustments. And people in the 50s and 40s, they would practice their fader moves. So they would like be like, oh, they didn't even have compression back then. So they would have to do things like, oh, I'm going to compress this really quickly. I'm going to bring this back up. I'm going to do this. And we're going to talk about compression today, but it's sort of a newfangled thing. And yeah, it's too bad that you can't automate the clip gain, but you could conceivably achieve the same thing by using both tools, I guess is my answer to that question. There's so many different ways you can access volume. You can access volume. You could also, you know, a lot of plugins will have the capability to allow you to adjust the volume on the plugin itself. So then you might ask yourself, do I adjust the volume on the plugin itself, or do I adjust the volume on the actual fader itself? And there are some complex things to say about that, because certain plugins expect certain plugins that emulate analog gear, they expect certain levels when you're coming into them. So there might be a case to adjust volume on the plugin side for that particular application. So it gets a little complicated, this whole conversation about volume. And but it's a very interesting conversation. Yeah, so good. So this is an example of a clip manipulation. And I think, yeah, we've talked about all these different warp modes. So I guess I'll ask the class. I'll call on someone particularly. And this will be a good on-the-spot kind of thing. So it's too bad I can't see people's face names on their, okay, it's funny, I was just gonna call, okay, let's see. Paul, are you here?
Yeah.
Okay, Paul, do you know the difference between Beats mode and, well, what is your take on these different warp modes?
On the different options there?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, beats sounds like the rhythm, and tone sounds like the pitch and the frequency, and texture would be like, I guess that would also be sound quality as well. Am I close?
You're close. You're close. And the help. I just noticed that the help is up too. The help
I didn't even read that.
Yeah, I didn't realize that too. But yeah, Beats is for like percussive sort of things. Like when you're on Beats mode, it keeps the transients at this original pitch, so that if you, let's say you slow down drums, it'll keep the transients of those drums, like the actual drum hits themselves, it'll sound like the original pitch that they were originally in, and it'll speed up and slow down the rest of it. So that might be actually worth revisiting again, just so everyone gets a chance to understand this a little bit more. So let's say I have a drum loop, and I take this one might be a good example actually. So I'll take this drum loop, and I already have it actually here somewhere, but I'll put it over here just for fun. I have this drum loop, and warp is on right now. And notice it's actually perfectly in sync with my clip. But if I actually divide this by 2, it'll get really slow, and you'll start hearing that there's going to be some weird artifacts. Wait, I did it wrong. So what you're hearing is the original sample at these particular points being played at the original speed that the sample was originally programmed with. And the reason you're hearing extra stuff afterwards is because this mode is on. But if I turn this off, right, you hear some silences in there, right? If I multiply this by 2 again, you'll hear it even more dramatically. You see how at every single point, these are the transients, and every single transient point, it's playing the sample at the original speed. Right? That's a function of beats mode. It's really privileging those transients and keeping the original feel of those drum hits, because a drum hit is the important feature of a drum loop. Like the actual hit and the actual pitch and the actual speed at which the drum hit occurs is a very important feature of a drum loop itself. If I change this from Beats mode to Complex Pro, you'll lose all of this sort of, you'll lose all resemblance to the drum hit. Right? It's speeding up and slowing down every part of the sample equally in order to kind of make this sample fit with this tempo that we're in. Whereas we're on Beats mode, it's only speeding up. It's not speeding up and slowing down the transients, but it's speeding up everything else. And you're not even hearing the speed up of everything else, because I have this mode where it's only playing the original part of the sample, and the rest of it, it's like left to do nothing. It's on loop forward mode. No, it's on off, basically, where it's just playing the segment and then it's playing nothing. But if I actually loop it, now it's like it's getting to the end of its point, and then it's like it's got to fill up all this extra time, right? So think about this one more time in this way. So look at the transients, look at how much time it's not playing. You notice how like most of the time it's not actually playing? So when you change this mode to this, it's going to fill up all the extra time with repetitions of the original thing. I don't know about you, but I think that sounds super cool. I got really, this is one of the joys of the software. You just find, I was not expecting that to sound so cool, but it sounds awesome. Now, if I switch it to forward and reverse mode, none of this stuff is available to you when you go to Complex Pro. They're totally different settings. They're basically you're going to hear sound at every single moment of this particular sample. It's every single part of the sample is being slowed down equally. Okay. So that's basically the deal with the difference between Beats and Complex Pro. But then with tones and texture, you get some granular synthesis capability. Which sound like repetitions in their own right as well. But because when you're creating grains, it's not easy to explain granular synthesis or what they've exposed, but you're basically chopping up the sample into small grains, and that's what this control really says, what it does, and then this imbues some sort of randomness, maybe in the timing of those grains. So anyway, that's a brief discussion of these three modes. I guess repitch will actually have this effect. Have you ever played, I mean, this might be before your time. It's before my time, actually. A record player, right? You've seen a record player, and if you actually like spin a record really slowly, it's actually it's actually a lower pitch, right? And if you spin a record really fast, it's actually a higher pitch, right? So the same with tape. If you play a tape really fast, it sounds like Alvin and the Chipmunks. If you play a tape really slow, I don't know why I'm doing this to play a tape, but I guess that's part of playing tapes. If you play a tape really slow, it sounds lower in pitch. So what this does is when you actually have this mode on, it'll actually change the pitch as you change the tempo. Cool, huh? So that's repitch. Those are basically the 5 warp modes. And yeah, and these warp modes do exist in simpler as well. So if you're here's the big consequence of warping. If you have warp on, a big consequence of it is that the BPM of the particular segment will always match whatever tempo the track is playing at. So that's a big consequence of warping. I feel like that could sound terrifying if you used a human voice. Absolutely, let's try it out. In fact, I've got a human voice right here, me singing something. So I'll just copy this over here. This is me half-assing while I'm singing. So let's see, if I warp this Complex Pro and I double the tempo, or if I do repitch, right? It's gonna I just sound like a bear. Right? So it does sound very interesting. Now, I love Complex Pro for vocal stuff. For a lot of stuff, I love Complex Pro because it actually, I feel like when you have Beats Mode, sometimes you get these extra rhythmic artifacts with Beats Mode, which makes sense, right? You heard it with slower tempos. If I have Beats Mode on right here. If I have Complex Pro, it sounds more even. It sounds strange and phasey, but that is something interesting that you could use. Yeah, depending on what you want to do. But a lot of times I'm not changing the speed. A lot of times, like, I'm just correcting weird timings in my own playing, where I'm like, oh, I want to like move this here, and it's going to have to warp it for me to actually do that. And I'm like, well, I think I want to put this in Complex Pro instead of keeping it in Beats, because it just sounds a little more fluid to my ears. But I was speaking to another friend of mine, and they hate Complex Pro. So go figure. It's more complex than I can communicate right now. But anyway, this is just a kind of a review on these different warp modes. And this might be a good time to actually put this into practice with simpler, you know. So I'm going to create a new, okay. If I want to create an instance of simpler, do I need an audio track or a MIDI track?
MIDI.
MIDI.
MIDI. Okay, I heard a lot of audio. Correct answer is MIDI track. No, I'm just kidding. Everyone got it right. MIDI track. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Instruments, and I'm going to go to Simpler. I'm going to drag on a Simpler as well over here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a drum sample and put it into Simpler. In fact, I think I have a drum sample right here, don't I? Yeah. It's an 80s not drum sample. Let's see, what do we have over here? So I'll look for a drum again. Okay, never heard that one before. Okay, I'm going to drag it on over here. And a consequence, remember, of Simpler, if warp mode is on, notice as I play lower, it actually slows tempo-wise, right? Not only does the tempo change, the pitch changes. This is basically like repitch mode. Remember we were talking about repitch mode? This is like repitch mode. If you don't turn on warp, it's doing a repitch mode. If I do turn on warp, notice how the pitch changes each time, but it still feels like the same speed. So that's kind of useful. So for instance, let me program this in and see how this sounds. So I'm going to create this. I don't know why my grid goes to these obnoxious settings when I first open a clip, but another reason why I love the shortcut. Anyone know what shortcut I'm using right now? Anyone? Command or Control 1, 2. These are honestly my favorite shortcuts in Ableton. If I were to pick my favorite shortcut, it would be this right here. I use it all the time. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to extend this over here. I'm going to create another one up here. Okay, actually, that was way too short. So I was expecting this to be much longer and this to be much longer. So a good way I can extend the length is, bam, here we go. Bam, here we go again. Bam, here we go again. Why did it stop? Well, the clip may be long, but I haven't exposed all of the clip on arrangement view, so it's not able to see the whole clip. It's only playing that much of the clip. So, right? So warp modes still exist in simpler, and ooh, I just hit all your faces. I don't want to do that. Okay, they still exist, and you can mess around with these different modes again. So it starts to sound more continuous. It's not paying attention. It's treating everything equally. Complex mode is treating everything else equally. Beats mode is treating the transients in a special way. It's keeping them at the original tempo.
You move the transients around on the sampler?
As far as I know, on classic you can't, but on slice mode you can. And no, you can't even do it on slice mode. What you can do, though, what's interesting is, I mean, you could do it outside the clip and then bring it inside the clip. But what you can do, this is a good segue to kind of talk about more advanced drum rack stuff. This is something that you could do that's kind of interesting. So let's say I have this particular, let's say I'm singing something. I'm just going to sing something. Let me set my input configuration correctly. Audio interface, there we go. I know that I'm on channel 30. Great. Hey, hello, ba, s, k, ch. Okay, so I've got this very intriguing collection of sounds. Right. Wait, did someone say something?
I said bars.
Oh, bars, yeah, that's right, man. Spitting bars for days. So what I got right here is an intriguing collection of stuff. And what I could do is I could drag this onto simpler. And simpler is here. So, oh gosh, sorry, I'm pressing the wrong command. Did I get rid of simpler? I think I might have, yeah, I got rid of simpler somehow. So let me go back to instruments. Let me go to simpler, drag it onto here. And now I've got simpler. And now what I could do is I could actually take this collection of weird utterances and put it over here. In classic mode,
hey, hello.
Hey, hello. It'll play all this stuff, right? Now, in one-shot mode, from what I understand, one-shot mode is like less flexible than classic mode because, like, I could be wrong, but it feels like, hello, hey, hello, hey. It's really intended when you like know you're not going to ever want to loop something. Hey. So, you know, for personally, I don't use it that much, or if I do, it's like I don't use it much very differently from classic mode. But slice mode, now that's something that's quite different. Now what slice mode allows you to do is what it does by default is it finds all the transients. So isn't that cool? It just found all the different transients of my sample. And it actually changes the behavior of my MIDI controller. So now somewhere over here, it's just going to play this particular sample. Bop. Hello. Hey. Hello. Bop.
Hey. Hello. Hey.
So this is kind of interesting, right? It's basically finding the transients of my audio sample, and it's allowing me to play them like an instrument. Now you might say, wow, that's really cool. I like that. There's something even cooler that you could do. As cool as this is, you can make this even more flexible by putting this into a drum rack. And one way you can do this is by right-clicking it and clicking, I think it's group to drum rack. No, that's not the thing. It's not the thing. You have to right-click here and you have to click slice to drum rack. And now what happens is it's basically converting all of the slices into their individual drums on drum rack. Cool, huh? Now I will preface by saying that drum rack is a really powerful thing. It's really a meta instrument, because what it allows you to do is it allows you to store a different instrument for every single cell. So you can have, like, for instance, let me just go back and show you this. All these instruments, I'm like, I'm going to put an operator right here. I'm going to put an impulse right here. I'm going to put an electric right here. I'm going to put a tension right here. It's crazy, right? You can put all of these different instruments. It's like it's a container for many instruments, which is really cool. And as I play this, it's basically playing that instrument for that particular note. So that's already pretty amazing that I can do that. But so what's happening here when I did that slice operation, it's basically creating many instances of simpler. So there's actually 10 instruments. Each one has their own simpler, right? All these different simplers. And they're all referencing the same audio file. So actually, I think if you zoom out, you can actually see the entire waveform. But it's just showing you the relevant part that we care about. It's just showing us the slice that we care about. But you can actually go back in time and expose the entire waveform and be like, I actually wanted this to be part of it, or something like that. This is really neat. You can do a lot of powerful things by slicing things in this way. And this is actually, incidentally, if you right-click an audio clip and you click Slice to New Midi Track, it'll actually do something very similar. It'll actually basically do what I just showed you. It'll basically show you all the slices. It'll basically.
You showed us the other day how you could, like, apply effects to each individual thing that you put on your drum rack. How do you do that again?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So the way you do that is, the way drum rack works is that this is the edge of this particular device that I've selected. So if I want to insert a device if I want to insert an effect just for this device, I could just drag it on in between here and here. So for instance, if let's say I add a beat repeat here. This is a cool effect. Audio effects, beat repeat. I'm going to drag this on here. Notice how I can put it here, or I can put it right here. What you want to do is you want to put it right here so that it only applies to this particular effect. Notice slice 3 doesn't have it, but slice 4 has it.
Oh, I see. It's like a little loading zone.
It's like a little loading zone. It's got its own, exactly. It only applies to this. But if you did want to apply it to the entire drum rack, you would just have to put it over here. And now as you go to different slices, you'll see it appear there as well. So this is one real, I'm glad you brought this up, because this is one of the real benefits of leaving slice mode and slicing to a drum rack, because now you can actually apply, this is the great benefit, you can actually apply individual effects to all of the different slices. And I think it's worth explaining some of these controls on the drum rack. This right here it shows you the devices for that particular cell that you're working with. This right here shows the chains. And what a chain is, stay tuned. It's right here, actually. Each instrument is really called a chain, okay? So if you, like, drag instruments over here, you're basically creating chains, and then what you can do is you can map these chains to different cells on the drum rack. You can actually map multiple chains to one cell. So for instance, this is where it gets a little more interesting. If I actually want to, I could actually put multiple drums on this one particular cell right here. There's a couple ways to do it. One way to do it, it involves me having to explain what this is, which is basically the I/O. Okay. Okay. I/O means input output. Okay. So what this is saying is that this chain, this little instrument, remember each one of these things is an instrument, and you're just seeing it correspond to this particular cell. It's like this instrument is a simpler, and it's being mapped to this particular cell. And what this is saying is that it's expecting MIDI note 1, and then it's going to receive on that channel. So if I actually do this, watch what happens if I put slice 2. What this is saying is that this exists on cell C1. If I put C1 here as well, look what happens. This becomes a multi. Now there are 2 chains on this particular 2 chains, okay? You know the famous artist 2 Chainz? Well, this is how he got his name. There's 2 particular cells. Sorry, there's 1 particular cell with 2 different chains, okay? It's off the chains right here. This is, no, I guess I could say this is off the chains right here because there's nothing on here, but it's not the class.
What is the play one? What is C3?
C3?
Like see where it says play. There's the column that says play.
Oh, okay. What that is doing is it's basically saying what MIDI note do I want to play for that particular sample. So,
okay. So that's like the pitch that you're gonna actually, that the note is gonna be. Yeah,
that's the actual pitch that you want it to play at.
Okay.
So I think there's a few other ways to do this multi-wrapping. I think one other way you can do it, if I remember correctly, is I think you can take a sample and you could option drag it on, and then what happens is it makes an instrument rack. We haven't talked about instrument racks, so I guess maybe I'll save that for another discussion. I will say that there are several types of racks in Ableton. There's an instrument rack, an effect rack, a drum rack, and I think those are the 3 types of racks, and they all behave very similarly. So if you understand one, you can kind of understand the others to some degree. So currently we have one slice. We have 1 chain per cell, but remember you can have multiple chains per cell if you'd like. And a chain is just an instrument, so this is just a simpler, okay? Oh wow. Okay, no, thought it was more exciting than it actually was. So anyway, getting back to business here, this is essentially a way for you to map multiple drums to one cell. So for instance, if I have, let me just delete all these slices. Let's say I want to have a really, really crunchy snare drum with many, many different samples of snare overlapped one on top of each other. So if I search for snare and I go to, let's say I'm just going to go to my favorite greatest drum hits, my favorite samples. I think it's greatest drum. Well, maybe I'll go to Hip Hop Genius. Let's just see what's there. Drum one shots, snares, a bunch of snares. What if I can't decide? Okay. Incidentally, you guys should be familiar with this right here. This is the pad overview section. This is how you change which pad you're working with. Personally, I prefer that C is the pad that's like on the bottom left. So you'll notice that if you can actually get that offset. Well, no, I guess what I'm saying is I prefer that C4 is like my starting pad, I think. Maybe it's not C4, maybe it's C3. Because that's where my middle C is on the piano. And this is like where I start programming my drum. So if you find that this gets offset or like it's not exactly where you want it to be, you can hold down Control and then you can actually move one row at a time. But if you just drag this without holding down Control, it'll move in 4 rows at a time. So something to keep in mind. So I'm deliberately making C3, which right here, and I'm going to start putting some snares on C3. So this is chain view. So I can just, I think what I can do is I can just drag these directly onto here. And right now they're not mapped to anything on the actual view, right? It's mapped to C1. Really, I want to map this to C3. My down function isn't working. Where is it? C3. Does anyone see 3? Oh, there it is. Look at that. Now it appears right there, right? Let's say I want to add another snare like this on top of it. So this is mapped to C#3, but I'll map it to C3. And now I get the kind of crunchiness of this snare, but I also get the clappiness of this snare, right? They're both kind of crunchy, actually. Maybe I'll add the reverb of this snare into the mix as well, C3. Maybe I want to have the body of that snare. And you can actually adjust the relative volume. So like, let's say I want more of the body of this snare, less of the crunchiness of these snares. So that's cool, right? You can actually, you can make it such that multiple instruments are affecting one cell. And this is one way of doing it, using drum rack. Okay, so that's important. So the receive symbol has to be the same. And the play symbol actually should probably be the same too, because they're all presumably playing the same pitch, because they're all on the same cell. But if I actually dragged on, let's say, I dragged on, this is weird. Let me actually move this multi to C#3. And notice how when I did that, it automatically adjusts the mapping correctly, which is kind of cool. I believe there might be a shortcut way to handle this so that you actually can do this without manually clicking. But let's see. Why don't I go to kick? I'll add a kick drum, as we always need a kick drum. And maybe I'll go to, I've got a lot of loops here. I saw a Bollywood one. I wonder if Bollywood has good kick drums. Let's check out Ghetto Grooves. Bonus, Ghetto Kicks. All right, cool. Let's check out kicks. All right, so I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to drag it on here. And let's see what happens. If I just drag it on here, it'll replace whatever was on here, right? Which isn't what we want. And actually, I put it in the wrong place to begin with. Command, put it over here. Put it over there. Let's say I hold down. Okay. I'll just drag another one using this method, okay? So now I've maybe want to arrange them in such a way where they're kind of logical. So like these are my snares, this is my kick. I think you can even rename this. So you could be like kick 1, kick 2, right? And you want to make it so that they're both playing on C3, right? So I'll go to C3. This is playing on C3. This is playing on C3. This is just to maybe make your life a little more organized. So now you get sort of, oh, look, the chain's actually let up. Now it's these 2 notes. Now it's these 4 notes. So you might want to add some more character to your particular instruments so that they don't sound as, they don't sound like one thing. You could make it sound like multiple things. there's a lot you can do with this. So I think for the particular device, you can actually add an EQ for this particular snare. So you're like, oh, I only want the low of this kick drum, and I want like the highs of this kick drum, the lows of this kick drum, and the highs of this kick drum. So what you could do, it's getting a little more advanced, but if I go over audio effects and I go to EQ, go to my handy EQ8, I think this is the one I wanted the highs on. I wanted the lows on this one. I didn't put it in the right spot. Did I? Let's see. Yeah, I did put it in the right spot. Okay. Let's say I only want the highs of this particular kick drum. Well, I could set the EQ so that I'm cutting off all of the lows. Now remember, if I want to cut off the lows, I've got to change my filter mode. There's 4 little filter adjustments right here, places where I can adjust the filter cutoff frequency. But right now, if I move this around, I'm not really cutting off the lows. I'm just basically, it's a shelving filter. I'm basically creating a shelf. Like, hey, I'm going to put something over here. It's like it looks like a shelf, right? What I want to do instead is I want to do a cut. And now,
Hey.
oh, that was me saying hey. Not what we wanted. Now I'm cutting off some more of those lows. Let's say I only want to make it more dramatic. Now I'm only getting like the sparkle of that particular. I'm only getting these high frequencies. Could be something you want to do, right? You only want the highs of this drum. You only want the lows of that drum. You want to combine it to make one new drum. This is basically a foray into racks. There's so much stuff you can do with racks, but if you understand how some of these racks, if you understand how a drum rack works, you'll have a better understanding of how an instrument rack works and an effects rack. We're going to definitely talk about those things, but I don't want to overwhelm you all at once. So, any questions on this so far? Does this make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, cool. Anyone else? Okay. Oh, I see some videos turned off. If you wouldn't mind. Oh, someone asked, will we cover sidechaining? Great question. We are going to cover sidechaining today, actually. We're going to talk a lot about EQ and compression and that kind of stuff as well. Let me see, I'm asking to start video for some people. Okay. Now, the thing to know about EQ and compression, I guess I'll talk about compression first. I have some slides on it. And I'm in the process of transferring some, I taught another class in Pro Tools, and I'm in the process of transferring some notes I took from that over here. I want to transition all of this onto my own website so I can just reference the same thing without making new stuff. But basically, here's something to know about compressors and expanders. They basically act on the dynamic range of a track. And I didn't complete the sentence, but the dynamic range refers to the volume differential of a track. I was trying to think of a different word than differential. It's like one of those words that I think I know what it means, but I wasn't 100% sure. I want this to be as clear as possible. In a graphical form, basically, it's showing you the difference between the loudest sound and the softest sound. Okay, really. So maybe I should say that. Between the loudest and softest sounds on a track. So right here, this is a good, decent amount of, well, it's all relative, but this is the dynamic range of this track. This is the softest kind of sounds in the track. These are, and these are the loudest sounds in the track. So if you just look at this particular difference or this whole thing, it's basically, you can even include the softest part altogether, but basically it refers to the volume level of in the track that you have available to you, that you've used up basically. This is a really important thing because compressors basically are interested in, well, at fast attack times, compressors are interested in evening out dynamics, so that like you see how there's a soft sound here and a loud sound here. With a compressor, traditionally with fast attack times, is used to achieving is basically averaging out these so that you have a consistent level, okay? Now I have to throw in some qualifiers in there because compressors are really complicated and they could behave differently, and we'll talk about that as well. So like we're talking about, a compressor decreases the dynamic range of a track while it's engaged. Okay, that's a really important, okay, while engaged. So downward compression, okay? There's actually two types of compression, in case you didn't know this. There's downwards compression and upwards compression, and they basically both work the same way. In the sense that they both even out the volume of a particular track. So you've probably seen graphs like this if you've had some experience with mixing before. But what this basically tells you is that it tells you a few things. I'll open it up in Ableton so we can kind of look at it in context. So what I'll do is I'll look for that vocal track that I had earlier. All right, so let me put it over here, put it where nothing else is. Oh, just converted it to a Midi track. Didn't want to do that. Okay, so I obviously have to insert words there. I just haven't thought of the lyrics. But what I want to do is I want to kind of even out the sound a little bit. Sometimes I'm like, right? It's like not so even. This is one of my, if you want to get good at mixing, there's two things that you should really become ninjas at, and that is EQ and compression. Those are like really, really fundamentally important. So what I want to do is I kind of want to even out the level of this track. So I'm going to throw a compressor on there. I'm going to throw the compressor on there. I'm actually going to go into, I believe there's a different graphical view where you can see the compressor as a graph that we were just talking about, okay? So with no compression, notice how this is a straight line.
I have a question.
Yeah, what's up?
Sorry. Yeah. So like when you are kind of mixing down a track from a music guy who's like actually really professional at it, what do you think are good levels to be working at, like on your individual tracks? I've heard like you should be working around -12 dB.
Yeah, I've heard that too. There's some good articles on this whole thing. I'd actually have to consult. That's like usually a figure that I work with, somewhere between -12 and -14. You don't have to push it too much.
And then like so after you mix down your track, do you ever kind of like maximize or like have a gain boost?
I do sometimes.
Or does it kind of naturally just end up, because like I feel like when you have all your tracks around -12, when you mix it all down, it ends up around -6, which is like what you're shooting for, right? Like -6, -8 range.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a tendency in today's age where there's a loudness war where you want to just make everything louder. But I think that personally, I find that the volume, if you hit that sweet spot of -6, anywhere from some people even think that -14 is acceptable. If you hit that, I feel like you're going to be sitting pretty, and you don't have to worry too much. I would say that you don't want to push any individual track to. Basically, I think what we're basically talking about is this idea that, like, what level do you set everything at? And you don't want to see red on your track meters. You basically want to make sure that your tracks are your peaks are sort of not exceeding. It depends on what genre you're working on, but -12 seems to be a good place, a safe place where if your peaks are there, that seems to be an okay place to be at. You could gain it up even more, but you don't have to. When you're actually summing all this stuff to a master track, you're gonna want something similar. You're not gonna want this to actually overdrive your particular faders. because you're going to find that it sounds distorted, it sounds clipped, and it's not going to in general sound nice at the end of the day. When you compress something, it actually pushes the average level closer to the peak value, so that you can actually get a little bit more loudness out of your track. But
like a little more, it's like perceived loudness, right? Like when you compress something, it could sound louder even if you kind of leave it at the same level, right? In a way, like it's kind of like perceivably louder just because it's more equal.
I guess you could say that. Well, the tendency for a lot of people once they compress something is to make it louder, because it's more even, so they have because it's more even, they have the tendency to want to push it higher, and
That makes sense, yeah.
So they kind of go hand in hand. But yeah, as far as your question, it's a complicated question, and different people have different points of view on this. But I've found that if my track is sitting kind of pretty at this point, I will actually often in my own workflow put some sort of maximizer plugin, and just sort of put the ceiling as minus 0.1. But I make sure that everything is really sitting pretty before I put the maximizer on, and otherwise I will hear some distortion. And it's just, I guess, like it's in today's day and age when everything is loud, I think it's just.
That's what I'm wondering, because like I see tracks and they literally are like -4 to 0, and like I'm wondering if that's okay. Like if on the master channel it doesn't really matter or what. I don't know.
On the master, I mean, if you see something -4 to 0, when I put a maximizer plugin on there, it does get really hot. And that does happen with my tracks. If you like hit the normalize button when you export, it will. You don't want to do that, first of all, because it'll ruin all the relative levels of your tracks. But yeah, I mean, I think in today's day and age, everyone's pushing harder and harder and harder. So that it was old advice. In the old days, people would just kind of leave it at this particular threshold. But now, I guess part of the sound in a lot of music today, there's a compression built in, and there's also a loudness factor as well that you have to incorporate in order to compete with the other tracks. So I think using a reference track is probably the best answer, because then you can kind of gauge how loud your track is compared to another track and see if that's where you need to be. But I know that's not like an easy answer. That's not a simple answer. There really isn't quite a simple answer. There's good articles I can point you in the way to. I can point towards your way, and I'll try to assimilate more content.
Maybe like I don't know. Maybe if you just kind of tell us what your mix down and mastering chain would be. Not right now, but like if you just like posted something.
Sure, absolutely, and it does differ depending on genre and how I feel. But yeah, definitely, I can definitely talk about that.
I would really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I'm gonna bring it back. It got a little advanced, but we'll talk about some of the fundamentals. Compression. So compression basically, as we talked about, it levels out a track. It levels out the dynamic of a track. So more concretely, there are a lot of controls that allow you to make a track more level. And one of the things that you want to be aware of, some of the knobs that you want to be aware of are the attack time, the release time, the knee, the threshold. All of these things are important. But let's just look at this graph really quickly. This graph basically looks like this graph, more or less. And what's happening in this particular graph is the following. What you see on the x-axis is basically the input level of the particular track, okay? That's the x-axis. The y-axis is the output level of the track. So let's say we're going over here, like let's say x is equal 5. This is a straight line, so like y is also equal 5. They're both exactly the same value, right?
Wait, what's the x-axis again?
It's the input value. It's the input volume of your it's the input volume that's going into your compressor. So, I mean, this is a graphical representation. So this is like the input and this is the output. And what basically is happening is you're basically, when it's a straight line, you're seeing that if I go along this graph and I look at this point right here, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The input equals 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The output equals 7. So there's no compression. Over here, input equals 8. The output equals 8. But if I start applying compression, what will happen is that, check this out. The input equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5. The output equals, well, let me keep going, 5, 6, 7, 8. The input equals 8. The output equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? So you're actually attenuating the volume of the track by a factor that much, okay? So notice how, like, I'm actually attenuating after this point right here. Like, you see, notice how this line stays the same up to here, but it only starts changing after this point right here, right? So what this point right here is called the threshold. And the threshold is basically the point at which you start compressing. You start engaging the compressor. So here's what I want you to think about. You have a sound going into a compressor. This is a threshold of volume, okay? So anything that's louder than this threshold, we're gonna make softer. Okay, so anything that's above this threshold, we're gonna make softer. So if you have a really loud sound with a lot of like spiky peaks, and every now and then it sounds like this, hey, da, da, hey, da, hey. All those heys sound really loud in contrast to all of the right? So what the compressor does is it allows you to make the louder parts softer. So I can demonstrate this through some sort of exaggerated audio. Okay, so if I do this and I record myself, hey, 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 okay? So I've got some really loud audio right here, and there's a compressor on this track. Now if I play this back, I'll turn off the compressor. Hey, 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 hey. So what the goal is to basically curb it down so that anything above over a specific threshold, like anything that's louder than a certain threshold, will get softer. Hey, hey, hey.
What does adjusting the knee do?
Hey, hey. Well, I'll talk about that in a little bit.
Okay.
That's a good question. Hey, 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 hey. Okay. So check this out. So originally, hey, hey, hey. Notice how all these heys, hey, 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 much louder than the original heys, right? But over here, hey, 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 hey. You see how all of them kind of sound relatively the same volume, right? That's a big, important part of the compressor. And in order to gauge this behavior, there are a couple of things you want to do. When you're using a compressor, you want to make sure, if you have your threshold all the way up here, the compressor is never going to do anything. So you always want to make sure your threshold is set. If the compressor's up here and you have this device on it, it's literally doing nothing. And you can see that it's doing nothing because there's no gain reduction happening. So you have to adjust the threshold so that it's basically somewhere in the ballpark of catching the sounds that are too loud, and then it'll make the sounds that are too loud softer. Hey, 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 right? Right now, there's also no compression because I haven't turned up the ratio. This is still a straight line, so no matter where I move this compressor, it's still going to be the same volume input as it will be the output. Hey, hey, right? So I actually have to change the ratio. The ratio, basically, what this means is that for every single,
Quick question.
sure.
Is that makeup button, when you toggle it on and off, is that change it from down compression to up compression? Is that what that is?
No, it doesn't do that. That's a great
Oh,
question.
that's the gain, right?
That's the makeup gain, exactly.
Okay, okay.
So what the ratio does is it basically, well, we've talked about the rate. Well, we haven't talked about the ratio. What the ratio will do is it'll basically squash the dynamic range. So when you set the threshold, when you set the ratio really high, it'll basically flatten the dynamic past that point. So what this ratio number means is that for every 2 decibels that comes through, only 1 will come out. If this value is really high, for every 8 decibels that for every 8 decibels that come in past this point, only 1 will come out. So it's strangling the dynamic considerably. It's saying, okay, if there's 8 decibels that come in past this threshold, only 1 will come out. So if you have
a volume loss, right?
What was that?
So you get a volume loss from compression. If you're not doing, well, you said there was 2 types of compression, moving a lower sound up or moving the higher sound down.
Right, right. So yeah, so you're losing volume in this means of compression. Absolutely. So what's happening is if you don't have makeup gain on, you're going to find that a downwards compressor will make things softer.
Hey.
Notice how soft everything is now, right? Because it's basically, if I lower this threshold really low, it's going to compress everything. Right now, infinity. So it's just going to basically squash it to nothing. Well, it's going to basically say everything above this line, everything above this threshold, just basically bring to this flat line right here. So I guess a practical use case of a compressor, there's so many, there are classes on this one topic. So like just on mixing and, there's classes on mixing and mastering, and it's a very deep topic. But if you have a vocal, for instance, I like to use a fast attack. Because I like vocals have, I don't know, I just like to even out the sound, so I like to use a faster attack on my vocals. And we'll talk about attack. We haven't even talked about attack. Attack is basically how quickly the compressor engages. So I want the compressor to engage right away.
So if you have a longer attack, then you're going to kind of be getting a transient, right?
Exactly. If you have a longer attack, you actually will, most of the time, you're actually going to interestingly reduce the dynamic range of a track, which is the weird, difficult thing to understand about compression.
If you have a longer attack or a shorter attack?
If you have a longer attack, because you're actually, like you said, you're gonna leave the transient in place, and then you're gonna squash everything past the transient.
Right.
And then as a result,
so you're saying, wouldn't that be a larger dynamic range?
Well, I consider it sort of a smaller dynamic range because all of the soft stuff, usually, because normally sounds occur with the loud stuff happening first and the soft stuff happening second, there's dynamic range built in the sound. If you put the compressor after the loud stuff already happens, you're going to make all the soft stuff non-existent, which is basically, in some ways, reducing the dynamic range of the sound overall. But what you're doing while the compressor's working, it's decreasing the dynamic range while it's working. But when you think about it big picture, if the entire sound as a whole, you're kind of losing some dynamic range. It's a little bit, but it's a little confusing, but it makes sense if you think about it.
I know what you mean.
Yeah, it's interesting in that way. So this is you can do a lot with the compressor. Unconventional, you can do a lot with the compressor, with just a good old-fashioned downward compressor, which is actually the device I use most of the time. Just this vanilla downward compressor. So we've got this compressor, and remember, if I lower the threshold, you can't make a hard and fast rule about the threshold. you can make kind of suggestions on attack times, like slower attack times, faster attack times. But with threshold, you just have to hear it out, feel it out, move. You always have to move this value. So if you use a preset for compressor and it's not doing what you think it should be doing, it's probably because the threshold's not where it needs to be. And if you lower it down even further, it has an effect of doing even more aggressive compression because it's just going to compress more. So kind of use your ears as a guide and decide what particular sounds do you want to trigger the compressor? Do you what volume do you want the compressor to engage? So maybe like those hays. Right? Notice if I make the attack really long, basically it'll sound just as loud as before. Because the compressor isn't getting a chance to engage on the things that we want it to engage on. It's basically engaging on the softer stuff.
So is the attack triggered when it exceeds the threshold?
The attack is triggered. The attack triggered when it exceeds the threshold. Well, the compressor engages when it exceeds the threshold, but it takes 1 second to turn on.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was asking.
So
what I mean is the compressor isn't gonna engage. Well, okay, I'm trying to understand what my question is. So when you hit the threshold in your sample, then there's a 1 second delay before the compression is applied. Is that what it is?
Yes, it'll take 1 second before the compression is applied. So it'll still get triggered by the loud stuff, but it'll take a second before so it'll actually do a lot of compression. It'll end up doing like that amazing amount of compression that it was going to do on the loud sound, but it'll just do it to the soft sound.
So it'll apply the compression in a second later.
Exactly.
So let's say your loud sound happens that exceeds the threshold, and then 1 second later, but it's not applied till 1 second later. So you're not going to compress the loud sound at all.
Yes, exactly. Oh, sorry.
Got it.
Hope that wasn't too loud, guys. Kind of imagine it'd be louder. How loud was that? Did the Zoom have some sort of compressor on built in? I don't know.
It was pretty loud.
It was pretty loud.
Yeah, it was loud.
Could I ask a quick question, Professor?
Yeah, sure.
What's the difference between downwards compression and just limiting?
Limiting is the same thing. It's just a limiter is a compressor that has a threshold that's has a ratio that's above 10 to 1. Or
okay.
Yeah, so they're the same thing, or 20 to 1. So I'll turn off makeup gain. Should have known that would happen. But now if I actually have this makeup gain off. It's basically that soft sound is basically disappearing altogether.
Is a maximizer kind of like a makeup compressor?
Yeah, maximizer is like a limiter with makeup gain. So yeah, it basically has both of those features built in. All right, let's see. Hopefully your ears are okay. I always feel bad when that happens, so apologies. I need to put a limiter on my master track or something, so that doesn't happen. Actually, Ableton has one built in, so I think that's just literally the loudest sound that could have come out of my software at that exact moment. All right, let's see. So, a practical application, let's see. A lot of the samples that you're going to get have some sort of compression built in. But if you're actually recording drums, or let's say I'm doing something like this. Let's say I beatbox something, nothing too fancy, but we'll just see if my drums aren't. Or let's actually apply compression to that vocal singing I did, and see if I can. It's nonsense, but you can still compress it and kind of see how it can even out the sound. So I've got some compression that I can put onto it right here. And all right, so let's see. All right. I still have the compressor on there? I guess not. Grab the compressor. I can switch to this mode right here. So let's say I have, okay, it's gibberish, but who cares? So it's not as even as I want it to be. So what I can do is I can do a fast attack, like I like, and I'll set the ratio, I don't know, somewhat aggressive, 4:1 maybe. So it's more even. You can hear the gibberish more evenly, right? And this is something I use all the time when I'm producing vocals or playing guitar. I listen for what I want, and it just has the effect of making everything more even. And once you make everything even, you can actually raise the volume, because you can imagine, like, you remember that really loud burst earlier. If every 5 seconds you heard a really loud burst, you would be scared to raise the volume, because it would be very disorienting for a listener to have to jump between those 2 points. So the net consequence would be you would lower the volume altogether, and you would just, every now and then something would be really loud. But if you wanted a more enjoyable listening, a seamless kind of smooth listening experience, you could just reduce the dynamic range, and you can raise the volume, because you don't have to worry about certain sounds getting too loud and certain sounds sounding too soft. There is a trade-off. You know, some people that are more old school find this to be a little upsetting, because they're finding that music in today's day and age in general is losing all of the dynamic range. Like classical music, jazz music has dynamic range. Like, you're not expected to, like, nowadays everyone's expecting to listen to music while they're driving in their car, while their engine is revving.
Sausage fattener.
What was that?
Fattener.
You cut out for a second.
Sausage fattener.
Sausage fattener, exactly. All of these, like, saturators, all these things that kind of make the sound louder. It's like it's almost as if they want you to listen in a really, really loud environment, so that you can still hear it. Like, have you tried listening to classical music or jazz in your car? It's really difficult, because you're driving, and all of a sudden something gets really loud and you have to turn on the volume, and then it gets really soft, you turn up the volume. You're kind of like doing some manual compression. So, but it's really nice. Not everything is meant to be listened to in your car, or in a space where things have to be consistently loud. It's okay to have dynamic range in your tracks, and you don't have to compress everything. There's virtue in that as well. So, but I will ask that you understand how to do this. And we're going to talk more about these particular parameters. And we're still going to get to sidechain. I still have to talk about the knee. Let's see, what's in the chat? What is the difference between peak and RMS mode? Okay, peak and RMS. So peak basically is compressing, it's describing the threshold in terms of the peak volume in the sound. So like the actual loudest part of the sound. So notice when you're listening to a particular track, you see, you listen to this, you're looking at this volume, right? There's like a peak, like this is the loudest part in the track. And then right here, over there where you see the brighter green region, that's the average level of the track. So the peak is basically referring to this. What was that? Sorry, I couldn't hear it. Chris, did you say something? Someone say?
Sorry, yeah. Sorry, my Zoom is weird. Like when I press spacebar, sometimes it glitches out. But RMS is root mean squared. I think what it's doing, I think it's taking, like you're saying, like some amount of samples previous in the average, like the root mean squared of them.
Exactly. It's root mean squared. It's an averaging function. So it basically looks at this. This is the average level of your track, and this is the loudest part of your track. So it's basically you can engage the compressor so that the threshold is looking at the average, or it's looking at the peak. And I guess both are okay to use. If you use the peak, you might be able to squash the peaks more dramatically. Like if we look at this particular thing, let's look at that other example we had right here.
Hey. hey.
We're in peak mode.
Hey, 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 hey.
I'm on RMS mode.
Hey, 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 hey.
Notice it's not doing much compression as I'm above the peak. Like it's not doing much compression at all. But once I actually lower it below the average,
Hey, hey, hey.
it's doing a substantial amount of compression. So for this particular application where I have like these weird bursts of sound, I probably use peak mode. So I just chop off the peaks, and the rest of this stuff is allowed to be softened. I'll save a discussion on expanders for another time, but I will say that the knee basically has to do with how quickly the compressor basically engages around the threshold. So like if you have a hard knee, the compressor, like notice how this is a straight line. It's basically input equals output at this point. Input is the same thing as the output, whereas this is the threshold. And if you have a soft knee, it's basically saying, oh, the input is not exactly the output near the threshold. Like the output, it starts to get compressed near the threshold instead of right at the threshold. So it can have an effect. I guess it can have more of a, it'll just apply more compression basically. And it'll apply compression near the problem spot instead of right at the problem spot. So you could experiment with that too. It's a subtle sort of thing. We've talked a little bit about attack times. We could talk about it in the context of a drum sound. So if I actually take a drum, let's say I take, let's see, just a drum sample. The problem is all these drum samples are like super processed and produced. Let's just take this one, just for fun. Let's see if we can do anything with this. Okay. Oh, this is actually not a sample. Let me go to a sample. Let's take a kick drum. Acoustic kick. Great. This will work really well, I think. So here we are. We've got our acoustic drum sample, and we have a compressor. Now, if I set the attack to be really fast, what will happen is, in fact, I think I could actually, let me actually see if this makes a difference. Let me actually drag, an oscilloscope onto this. I don't know if this will make any difference. It's doing some gain reduction, substantial gain reduction. Let me turn off the compressor. Now check this out. Let me actually add a utility in here just to be safe, protect everyone. It's funny, these things don't come out too loud for me, but it could. It's just a Zoom thing. Let's see, add a utility. Just to be safe. Because when I apply the makeup gain for this oscilloscope is not really doing much. But check this out. If I have a really fast attack on this kick drum, listen to how you can actually hear a lot of the release of the kick drum. Meaning like the attack of the kick drum is basically the onset, like the ba, 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 right? The release of the kick drum is basically like the decay of the sound, like the decay of the sound in general, right? You can hear a lot of that rumbling, a lot of that stuff, right? Because the attack's really fast. If I raise the attack, notice how you hear a lot more of the click, the clanginess, the actual kick itself, right? Tell me if that's too loud, by the way, guys. I have no, it sounds okay to me, but. more percussive. Okay, it's a good volume. Thank you. So notice how that works, right? Interesting, right? So when you're compressing, now you hear more of the tail end of the sound, right? What you're really hearing, you're basically squashing. Ooh, this is a really hard color to see. You're basically squashing all of this, right? When you have a really slow attack, right? You're basically making this really soft. When you have a fast attack, you're basically making this really soft, which in turn makes everything else a little louder relative to this once you apply makeup gain. Okay? So if you want to make your drums a little punchier, like you want the actual drums to punch through a little bit, you're going to want a fast attack. No, slow attack, I mean, sorry. Interesting, right? This is off, this is no compression. This is with compression. No compression. Listen to how tight, how the attacks get tighter once I turn on compression. Right? So, Jumanji type beat. I still have to see that movie, by the way. So, I think I know what I'm going to be watching. Yeah. So this is really handy. So this is totally a different application of setting the attack at a different level than for the vocal sample. For the vocal sample, I just want to compress everything right away. But for drums, if I want to make something punchier, I'll often make the attack slower so that I can get a punchier kind of drum sound in that regard. So this is useful knowledge to know. It might be a good time to take a little bit of a break, and then we can talk about sidechain compression, and we can talk a little bit more about some of the other synthesis things that we can talk about, and we can talk about EQ. This is an ongoing conversation. So like if you guys have any ideas for what you'd like me to talk about, like Chris is talking about levels for overall track. I have that somewhere in the syllabus, but it gives me an idea for what everyone wants to learn about. So please keep the ideas coming.
I would definitely appreciate like a mixing and mastering main, like, I don't know, all your little plugins, and preferably like with defaults in Ableton, as opposed to like a mastering suite. Because like I feel like mastering suites make it a little too easy when you're trying to actually understand it.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I can talk about all of that. It'll probably be, you know, realistically speaking, it'll probably be closer to the end.
Yeah, that's fine.
Just because
even if it's just like, even if you just like post a link on the OneNote to like a good resource or something.
Sure. No, I do want to talk about it too. There's a lot to say about it. This is one of the things that's really deep. So like for instance, I taught a class on Pro Tools, and it was like mixing and mastering. It gets really deep. Like depending on what you could put. So we're going to talk about EQ, for instance. It can have a totally different flavor if you put the EQ before the compressor or after the compressor. There's just so many little peculiarities like that, and it's really like, for that particular class, it was just basically going through all these tracks and like applying different effects and experimenting and trying and seeing what sounds good and what comparing it to. It's just a very hands-on activity. So, but absolutely, we'll talk more about that, about mastering and all of that stuff with time. There's different perspectives on it, but yeah, we'll just have to keep burning in the basics for compression in particular, because I think a lot of people don't know what a compressor is. So you know, this will be on the next homework assignment. So make sure you start understanding how a compressor works. It's all on the OneNote, and it's important for your own music. It'll just make your music sound better. So with that being said, let's take 10 minutes. Let's start again at 12:50. So I'll see you in 12 minutes.
All right, sounds good.
All right. All right. Oh, no, we still have some time. All right. Okay. All right. I think it is time, guys. Start the video. All right. By the way, you might have gotten an email from someone. I don't know.
I got it.
All right. I don't know who's sending. I don't know who's sending this stuff, but it seems to be interesting in the least. I think I got the email too, and it seems like they use some of the software that I use. So it's very strange. But anyway, I think we can talk about sidechain compression. Let me share my screen. And then we can talk about EQ. There's a lot of stuff we can talk about. We can talk about, I think it's good to talk about reverb. And I was going to talk, I mean, I made this like 80s track as in a means to talk about analog, but it's funny, we haven't really talked about any of the stuff on this track, but we could talk about that as well, depending on how we're feeling. But I guess we'll talk about sidechain compression. This is a cool application. In fact, I think I could actually do it on this 80s track that I was making already. Maybe it'll sound cool, we'll see. You know what, I'm just gonna create a new track and do it that way. Well, no, I'll just do it on this track. Whatever. So what I have right here, I'll just create new chords so that they like stay so you can hear it more steadily, okay? So what I have, instead of these chords, I'll just, well, you know what? This is a good opportunity to show you what legato mode is. I think I've shown you this before. If you select the MIDI clip and you select the legato, you have to select all the notes in the MIDI clip. You select legato, right? You see all the notes get really connected, like, right? They suddenly have the full breadth of the particular, they extend durationally to the next chord. I don't know if this made a difference. They kind of already had that feel anyway because I was actually holding down the pedal on my keyboard. I could talk a lot about pedal, but we'll save that discussion for another time. Sidechain compression. This is a classic use. What sometimes people do is that they put a compressor on things and that aren't the kick drum, for instance. And so that every time the kick drum plays a note, everything else ducks out for the time being. And in order to kind of show you how this works, let me actually delete these other tracks. A lot of stuff on this track. And so this is my premise. I've got drums here, very simple drums, just kick and snare. And my premise is that every time the kick comes in, I want to basically duck everything else out of the picture. I want to lower the volume of everything else while the kick drum is playing. So here's one way I could do that. We'll start by compressing one thing. We'll just start by compressing only this synthesizer line, these chords. Okay, we'll start by just compressing that. And what I'll do is I'll throw a compressor on there. Now the compressor is here. And what's going to happen is if you don't do anything to it, it's just going to compress the sound. It's not really doing much because the sound is quite compressed. It's a square wave, so it's basically compressed already. A square wave, just to show you what a square wave is, what this sound really is, I have a plugin that I've downloaded. It's free, go figure. And it's basically an oscillator, oscilloscope, I should say. And I believe I can find it by doing, I just had it earlier. It's called M oscilloscope. So you can see very clearly that this is actually, I'm on the wrong. The reason it's looking all complex is because there's a chord being played. If I put this on this track, you can see it's basically a square wave. So essentially, it's compressed. But anyway, what we want to do is we want to basically duck this sound out whenever another sound is playing, particularly the kick drum. So in order to do that, we're gonna unfold this particular button right here, and we're going to click Sidechain. And now this particular track is sidechained to another track, which we have to select. So if I select the audio from drum rack, and then I choose the kick, and let's say I do kick, pre-effects, post-effects, post-mixer, I'll just do pre-effects, okay? Now I'm in a situation where every time that kick drum hits, we're gonna try to engage compression on this particular track. So check it out. This particular bar is showing you the actual kick drum. So if I turn on this little headphone thing, you're hearing the kick here. You're not seeing the original track you're just seeing the kick drum, okay? So we're basically, what we're doing see how it's pumping with the kick drum? Like every time the kick drum hits, this particular little synthesizer gets softer in volume. So what we're doing is we're actually compressing. It's like we're using the kick drum as the guide for what we're compressing, and then we're applying the compression to the synthesizer. So it's like every time that kick drum gets below, it goes above a certain threshold, it's like, oh, let's compress it. Just kidding. We won't compress it. We'll compress the synthesizer with the same parameters that we would have used to compress the kick drum had we actually compressed the kick drum. So what we get is this. Right, that's the kick drum. So if I actually turn off the solo, this may or may not work for this particular track. I'm kind of feeling it, I'm kind of not. There's lots of things that would kind of jurisdict whether or not, like how you do this.
Would you ever sidechain the snare over the kick for like a song like this, where the snare is so impactful?
Let's see. Why don't we try it out? Rhythmically speaking, like the kick drum always happens on like a downbeat, or usually, so that's why I think it works well. But it would happen on another. Let's see what happens. So, what we're going to do, what Adil suggested, is sidechaining this synthesizer track to the snare drum instead. So what we're going to do is we're going to do audio from, and it's still going to be the drum rack. And now we're going to sidechain it to the snare. That sounds cool, actually. I like it.
I kind of like that.
Yeah, it's cool. It's not so obvious. Yeah, I like that too. So this is totally something you can do. You're basically ducking things out during certain times, and you can play around with the rhythms of these. So you can actually do something where you might want it to like duck out at very rhythmic intervals. Like you might want to do something where, let's say I create a new drum track called, this is more of potentially an advanced technique, but let's see. If I go over here to my drum rack and I duplicate this and I call this, let's say I call this dummy. Okay, I'm gonna call this dummy. It's not very nice, I know, but I'm gonna call it dummy anyway. And this is a great question, Jarrett, because this is gonna tie in exactly to what we're talking about. Is pre-post effects going to sidechain before or after the audio is processed? Yes. So, so what I'm claiming is I'm going to create a dummy MIDI clip here, dummy track, which allows me to basically, wait a second. Right. Oh, it's not showing the right clip. Right now I've folded my MIDI, so it can't, it's not exposed, but what I could do is I could do something like this. I don't know how this is going to sound, but right now this is, I'm not sure if this will work, but let's see if this works. I'm going to mute this. Let's see if this actually works. What I'm trying to prove here is that you can actually cause something to trigger the sidechaining, even if it's not playing at that exact time. So let's try dummy. Not quite doing something right here. Maybe this is what you got to do. Maybe you mute it. Let's see. I think this has to do with Jarrett's pre and post effects thing. So maybe I'll keep this unmuted. Yeah. This is how you do it. So now we're at, okay, this is exactly how you do it. Okay, so now you can create little rhythmic variations. You can have like, let's say you want it to pulse at in a certain way. If I actually look at but I don't want it to necessarily go with the kick or the snare. I want it to go with some rhythm that I've created myself. So if I look at the actual track, let's go back to the actual synthesizer track so we can look at the compressor, and let's listen to what. That's what's actually being played pre-mixer. If I do post-mixer, nothing will get played. Because it's basically saying, like, before I muted this drum track, there was audio coming into it. I muted it, and now audio is not coming. Like after the mixer, basically at this point in the signal chain, there's nothing coming out. But at this point in the signal chain, or around here, there's something coming in. So that's this is more of an advanced technique, but if you want to do sidechaining where you don't want to limit yourself to using the drums that you've already programmed, but you want to have some sort of dummy clip where you can be like, I want to sidechain this. I want to do this. Ooh, this is obnoxiously loud. Let me lower the volume. It's muted. Well, let me turn off the headphone audition. So let's see what happens here. By the way, when you're selecting regions to repeat, you want to make sure you include the actual region. Like if I try to duplicate this and I select this, you might think, oh, it'll just duplicate these 2 bars, but actually you'll notice how this right here is not being duplicated. You want to also include this. Duplicate, duplicate. Right now it's not muted. Or right now it's being soloed. Right now it's being soloed. That's what's happening. So if I go to my analog, turn on. Right? So you can do a lot of interesting things that way. This is sidechaining. Sidechain compression. Basically, it allows you to throw things out of the way when something else is playing. So a lot of times, you'll sidechain to the kick, or I guess today we tried sidechaining to the snare. It sounded cool. So that's basically the gist of it for sidechaining purposes. And we actually did end up having to use this pre-effects, post-effects, post-mixer thing, because if it's pre-effects, it's basically it's grabbing the audio before any effects are applied to it. If it's post-effects, and I guess mute is considered an effect. It's convenient that it is, but for our sake, we were able to use it in that purpose. Post-effects it's like grabbing the audio after the effects. And then post-mixer is grabbing the audio after the effects, but after the mixer itself. Because like you could be grabbing the audio after the effects, but the mixer might be at 0. So you want to make sure that you grab, well, depending on what you want to do, you want it to either be, this is what they call pre-fader or post-fader. You can grab the audio before the fader, either pre-effects or post-effects, which is pre-fader, or you can grab it afterwards, which is post-mixer or post-fader. Don't hurt your brain too much thinking about that. I don't think you'll run into it too much, but it's something to be aware of in case you do. I guess for this particular application, it does rear its ugly head. So I guess what I would suggest is just use pre-mixer for everything, and you'll save yourself a headache if you're trying to sidechain using that method. So that is a little bit of sidechain compression and compression. It's all compressed. I'm sorry. This is a compressed conversation on compression. But now I think we should talk about, I guess we could talk a little bit about EQ. And so if compression kind of levels out a sound, or it can also kind of have this pumping effect that we've just talked about, EQ can actually make a sound transform the kind of timbral quality of a sound. You did this, you learned a little bit about this when you used a filter sweep. We did this, right? We grabbed an EQ in that instance. When we went to audio effects and we went to EQ8, right? I think we did it, we dragged it onto our master track. And what we ended up doing, we changed the filter mode and we did this. Right? You're basically changing the frequency content of your sound when you EQ. So you might find that certain sounds have are not exactly what you want in your, you just won't want certain sounds. Like your voice, there might be certain frequencies that your microphone's picking up that sound really strident or harsh, and you just want to cut those out of your sound. Well, that's a good use of EQ. Now, if I drag EQ8 onto this particular track, there's a lot of presets that could come in handy. They kind of come baked in for specific purposes. Lots of interesting creative effects, lots of nice stuff. But you might a classic way that people use EQ is in a staged sort of manner. So oftentimes you'll see something like this. You'll see subtractive EQ, where you're kind of getting rid of unwanted frequencies. And then you'll see additive EQ, where you're kind of adding certain frequencies. So for instance, like in the 400 hertz range, there's often a lot of boxiness in a sound. I don't know if this particular microphone would capture this particular time, but you might say, I want to cut some of that out. So I'm going to choose this band right here, and I guess I'll solo it.
Baby, I got my weed and a lot of weed and I gotta run out. Trying to figure this out, baby, I got.
And one way you could test to see, and this is very subtle, by the way, and I don't know how much of this is carrying over through Zoom. One way you can test if a frequency is good or bad is just by raising it really high.
Trying to figure this out, baby, I got my weed and a lot of weed and I.
And this is the sort of boxy sound I was talking about. You might find that this boxy sound is something you don't want in your vocals.
Trying to figure this.
So you're like, okay, I can hear the boxiness, now let me just get rid of it.
Trying to figure this out, baby, I got my weed and a lot of weed and I.
Right? Now you might find that that's too much. You might just want to do 3 decibels of gain reduction.
Trying to figure this out, baby, I got my weed.
Right? That might be more along the lines for what you want to do. This is sort of a broader cut. You might want to do, remember, if you adjust the Q, you're basically adjusting the intensity, the resonance of the filter. So if you make this really broad, you're gonna affect a huge range of frequencies when you lower the gain for that particular band. But if you make it really broad, if you make it really narrow, you're going to find that you're only working on a particular frequency.
Trying to figure this out, baby, I got my weed and a lot of weed and I.
You'll hear some resonance, right? You'll actually hear specific frequencies.
Trying to figure this out, baby, I got my weed and a lot of.
So there's a lot of stuff that you can say about this, but actually I've got a cool little program that might have been shipped over to you. But let's see. There's software that I really like called EQWise, and what it does is it basically I actually bought the software, so I think whoever sent it stole my license. But basically what it does is it has this sort of EQ graph, but it overlays specific problematic things that you might expect on top of a graph. So it might say, you might expect some mud in this particular frequency range. You might expect some honkiness and nasality in this particular frequency range. Or you might get some more presence in this frequency range, some clarity, some air. So it kind of I like it because it doesn't do the work for you, but it gives you it gives you a mechanism for what to listen for. So purportedly, if you increase this,
trying to figure this out, baby, I got
sounds
my
muddy.
weed and a lot of weed and I gotta run out.
Right? If I do this, this is going to sound honky and nasal.
Trying to figure this out, baby, I got my weed and a lot of weed and I gotta run out.
Right? If I do this is going to increase the presence.
Trying to figure this out, baby, I got my weed and a lot of weed and I gotta run.
If I do this, clarity and air, this is going to increase a lot of the high frequencies. Just give it a little more shimmer.
Trying to figure this out, baby, I got my weed and a lot of weed and I gotta run.
So that adds a lot of sibilances. I personally like that sound. It sounds shimmery and nice, right? I like that. So something I might do is something like this.
Trying to figure this out, baby, I got my weed.
Right? You can play around with this as much as you want. Another thing that a lot of people do immediately is to just cut off the lows. And you have to be careful about which frequency you kind of cut off, because males and females have different fundamentals. So just kind of listen to the point where it just starts to become barely perceptible that you're doing anything, and just cut off the lows, because you want to save some space for the other instruments. Now, a big part of mixing is that you're trying to basically, you want other instruments to occupy this region. You don't want your voice to kind of occupy this region. Also, by EQing it like this, you're also you're also preventing, you could potentially prevent the compressor from acting on it. Because remember, compressors have the effect of making louder sounds softer. So like after you compress a sound, all of these low sounds, even though they might not be that obvious, once you compress the sound, the low sounds, the low rumble sounds might become louder in relation to the actual loud sounds that you've now compressed. So it's kind of a good idea, especially I found this to be very handy, even though you don't immediately hear the gains, no pun intended, to just do a low cut on instruments that don't have a bass function.
Trying to figure this out, baby. I got my reading now.
It's very subtle, and it'll make your life easier for mixing later on. So this is sort of like a simple walkthrough on mixing. Tools like this are really, ultimately, people are going to give you guidelines like this. If you go online, they'll say stuff like this: cuts in the 800 to 1.5 kilohertz range can reduce honkiness or boxiness. Use a narrow Q factor. All these little things, it just kind of is built into this EQ, so you can kind of experiment and put a sound to these particular attributes. I very much like this, and it's got it for all kinds of other instruments as well. Presets are also really good to look at because you'll find certain shapes in common. You know, like I've tried to start accumulating. I don't have it on this one, but I've started to try to accumulate like a bunch of presets for all of these different sounds. Like these are all of Ableton's presets on a tom drum. Like why do they do this? Like what makes this so special? Like let's look at the actual chart. So if I look at a tom, you know, it seems to me they're trying to increase the thump and the body of the tom drum, right? 100 hertz range. They're some of the low end rumble, right? And then they're kind of increasing just ever so slightly the high end to add a little more attack and presence and air, right? That's the rationale, you could say, for them choosing this. But notice how both presets have, in general, the same shape. This one right here has a little bit more presence, a little bit more attack. But presets are a great starting point because it'll give you a sense for how other people have done it. And then you can kind of tweak either by just modifying what they've done or by in context looking at a chart like this and trying to make adjustments like this. Now this chart does exist online for free, but it doesn't live with this plugin in the manner that it does the way I'm showing you. So it's up to you whether you use something like this, but I find it to be a convenient way to learn and to get these kind of numbers baked into my head, because this is a parametric EQ, but a lot of times you're gonna, well, it depends on what you do. You might run into an EQ that doesn't have a graph at all. It might just look like, this.
Wait, so we got that EQ from the mysterious man email?
Yeah.
Wow, what a great guy.
I know. It's incredible. Yeah, I don't know who this person is, but I know for a fact they stole my license on that one.
That's amazing. I'm juiced. I like that a lot. That it had all the presets too.
It has all the it's fantastic because I got tired of people like just saying like, oh yeah, it's like 400 to 600 hertz. Like I would just always forget that information, like the way I work, and so it's just like I'd rather focus on other things. It depends on who you are, but yeah. And it comes in handy when you're using plugins like this too. Like if you want to use an EQ like this, knowing the numbers comes in handy because that was a graphical EQ, but this EQ is just like, it's the same thing, but it's not showing you a fun graph. Like you just have to know like, oh, at like 1000 hertz, I want to make a boost, and I want, well, this is actually a compressor. Let me actually change it. So like it's actually saying it like this amount of hertz so good. I want to make a boost right here. I want the Q factor to be this, right? you might run into a situation, especially if you're like using an analog hardware board, where you have to EQ like this. And I know friends who love EQing like this, and I'm trying to learn how to EQ like this too, to a greater degree, just so I can become more versatile. But knowing the numbers helps a lot. And so familiarizing yourself with these numbers and just making, I'm thinking of honestly just making flashcards and being like, okay, know these numbers cold, instead of kind of relying on these numbers as a crutch, which I'm guilty of, to be honest. But honestly, there's only so many different classical ways of doing something, and that's why presets are useful. And that's precisely why when you go to a kick, when you go to all the presets, they all look somewhat the same. So it's just some added context on why they made the choices they did. So equalization is an important thing. I'm trying to drive home the point that EQ and compression, those are two things. If you want to get good at mixing, just become a ninja at those two things. Now, there's so much more we could say about this. I don't want to saturate your brains. I'd like to see you work this week on using an EQ and compression for your particular tracks. It might be the case that I might ask you to record vocals for your homework assignment, and or record something. It doesn't have to be so obvious that it's vocals. You can mangle it up. Record something with a great deal of dynamic range, and then squash that dynamic range using a compressor, just knowing that you know how to do that. And then another component might be doing sidechain compression. Those are two things that are so common to know how to do. For dance music, sidechain compression has become such a cliche that it's really important to learn how to do it. So that's that. There's another thing I want to talk about that's really helpful in mixing, and that is reverb. And we haven't talked about reverb yet, or return tracks. So I'll go to audio effects and I'll go to reverb. And I don't know if you have this device Echo. I'm still investigating that with myself, but I'll go into a classic reverb. I use it. I'm just still learning some of the specifics of it. Ableton just released this device for Live 10. Reverb is a very interesting phenomenon. Now I'll show you a little thing on the OneNote about it. This is the 2-note because I'm referencing another class. If I go to audio effects and I go to reverb, there's this slide right here. And what reverb really is this idea that if you have speakers blasting at you, some of the sound will come directly at you. Like the sound from the speakers will go in all kinds of different directions. Some of the sound will come directly at you. That's the direct sound, right? If you're right in front of the cone of the speaker, you're most likely to get hit with the direct sound. But you're still likely to get hit with all of these other sounds. Like, for instance, the sound might also bounce on the floor, bounce on the ceiling, bounce on the floor, and then hit you. That is an early reflection. That is a third order early reflection, okay? Because that might also hit you. And, that sound, I guess I'll ask you, will this sound arrive later or earlier than the direct sound? Later, right? Because it's gonna bounce through your room, do all kinds of crazy wiggling and wobbling. It's gonna finally get to you, right? Look at how pleased this man is. He's hearing all the reflections, right? Now, a first order reflection is just one bounce and then you're back, right? So a consequence of all of these reflections in some, like if you basically perceptually like take into account what this person is listening to when they hear all of these reflections, like eventually they're all going to come a little bit later in time. Like the later reflections will kind of come later in time, and it'll kind of create this like reverberant field. And that is basically what reverb is. It's just a bunch of delays. It's like all of these the original sound is getting delayed, and many different copies of this delayed signal are getting sent to you. And as a result, you're hearing that, and it sounds kind of like a wash of sound. And you can imagine if one of these bounces into like some like highly ornate geometric shape, it'll bounce like 60 times before it leaves and then finally escapes to your ear. And it might like arrive all the way over later in time, right? So that's basically the principle of reverb. This is important to understand in order to understand how this device works. Reverb, first of all, is a very nice thing. I always like, I'm guilty, very guilty of just dousing all my stuff in reverb because I just like the sound of it. So if I put reverb on this, check out how it sounds now.
Trying to figure this out, baby.
Now if I add reverb to this, check this out.
Trying to figure this out, baby.
It sounds like washed out and like, it just sounds like more smooth, right? Now how do you use this parameter? How do you use the parameters in this reverb? Well, you know how I talked about how there's early reflections and then later reflections? Well, the early reflection stuff happens over here. The later reflection stuff happens over here. And if you want to control the amount of early reflections, you control this. And if you want to control the level of the later reflections, you control this. Okay? So just to play around with that, let's see what happens. So this is all the early reflections. It sounds less like gibberish. It just sounds hard to understand now because it's like covered in reverb. This is why reverb's great. Now maybe I don't even have to write lyrics because reverb will just cover up all my words and I'll never have to do it. So now let's just turn off the later reflections and keep the early reflections on.
Trying to figure this out, baby.
Right. So now I'm hearing kind of like this kind of chorusy kind of effect for these early reflections. But I'm not hearing a long sustained reverb tail, right?
Trying to figure this out.
Right? As soon as I stop playing, it'll stop. But if I turn on diffuse all the way up, it kind of lingers for a little bit longer, right? Everyone following along so far? Like early reflections, later reflections, right? But here's the thing. You might find that like decay time, what does that have to do with reverb? Well, basically, decay time has to do with reverb in the following way. It has to do with how much time it takes before you can basically hear a sound, before the sound becomes like 1/1000th of its initial amplitude. They call this the T60 time. So like if I set this really high, this reverb will last for a long time. Basically it'll take a minute before the reverb becomes 1/1000th of its original volume. And then you can lower the decay time to shut it up, right? So that is, it can have like, these two controls, the size of the room and the decay time are kind of related. Because you can imagine if you increase the size of the room, you can kind of have more spaciousness and more potential for different bounces potentially. But now you're kind of choking the reverb. It's like it's this gigantic room, but there's no decay. It's kind of choked. So maybe like the room's really big, but the walls are really absorptive. Maybe it's like super absorptive walls that like are sucking up all the sound, and it's like maybe now it's like a gigantic room with with totally bouncy, like a cathedral. Right? So if I were to emphasize two controls that are really important for this device, it would be this and this. Like, these are really important. Now, what if I made the size really small and I made the decay time really long? Now it's like a really infinitely small room, but it's like a lot of reverb. It's going to sound very resonant. Right? It's like choking it in that regard. Like it's like looking for a way to bounce around, but it's like a metal sheet. It's like collapsed in, and all it can do is resonate, right? It's got all this energy, it's pent up, so it's just gonna like cause the entire thing to resonate. So that's a little bit about reverb. You're gonna see very familiar processing. Like you're going to see shapes like this all the time. This is a filter, right? This looks familiar, right? So what this is saying, take a look at the chat. Me yelling into my local gutter. I'm going to try that after class. So what input processing allows you to do is it allows you to determine what part of the sound gets processed by the reverb. So you might say, like, I only want the highs to get processed by the reverb. And now it'll sound like shimmery.
Trying to figure this out, baby, I got
Right, only the highs. The lows are left alone. And actually, all the lows are getting cut out because the reverb is processing everything. So if I have it at 50%, by the way, dry wet refers to how much of the plugin is being active right now. So only if it's at 100%, the plugin is completely acting on the sound. The original sound is all getting processed through this plugin, and that's that. But if I set it at 50%, now 50% of the sound is left unprocessed, but 50% of the sound is left processed. So now you're going to hear some of those lows come back in.
Trying to figure this out, baby, I got
Right? So now if I do a high cut, so this is a low cut, right? I'm letting the high frequencies come in and the reverb's shimmering, right?
Trying to figure this out.
Now if I switch that and I do a low cut,
Trying to figure this out, baby, I got
that's dramatically different, right? So the reverb is acting on a different part of the frequency of the sound. So you can kind of do processing like that. So you can EQ, you're essentially EQing the part that you want the reverb to be applied to. And it's actually filtering the sound altogether. So it's like if I have low cut on and I have 100% on, none of the lows will even come in. Right? None of the lows are coming in. Now, like, none of the lows are coming in because every bit of the sound is getting filtered and then being reverberated through this algorithm. But if I have it at 50%, at least 50% of the sound will come through unscathed.
Trying to figure this out, baby.
In fact, when I have it at 50%, basically,
Trying to figure this out, baby, I got my...
right? Yeah, 50% of it will be left unprocessed. Or at least the ratio will be that half of it will be unprocessed and half of it will be processed. And so realistically speaking, most of the time, this is a really important knob because most of the time when I apply reverb, I'll usually have it so that I'm not applying much reverb.
Trying to figure this out, baby, I got my...
Just like something really small, right? It's like when I have it in the context of my song, I don't want it to like be completely washing out all the stuff. I might want that, but I might have it really low.
Trying to figure this out, baby, I got my...
Maybe something like in the 4 to 5% range, right? So this is useful. You could set your reverb, like you could figure out what kind of sound you're going for by turning it all the way to 100%, messing around with these parameters, and then you could bring this down to a reasonable level where you're not only hearing the reverb. There are other things to say about this device, and I could just leave you to your own devices, but I'll just explain this to you, and if this is like overwhelming to process, just like think about what I've already told you instead. So I talked about how you can kind of affect the early reflections and you can kind of affect the later reflections using these parameters right here. So if you turn on spin, it's going to add some sort of irregularity to the shape of the room. So
Trying to figure this out, baby, I got my...
And it's gonna make it sound kind of wobbly and it's gonna change the pitch, right? If I have it to this direction. Now this is the amount of spin that I have in the x-axis and the amount of volume of that spin that I'm applying to it. So if I have all the spin,
Trying to figure this out, baby, I got my...
nothing's gonna happen, right? This is just basically the modulation amount. This is the amount of spin. So it's basically like modulating. It's like using an LFO to modulate the sound, essentially. So if I have the spin over here,
Trying to figure this out, baby, I got my ear.
sounds kind of artificial. I don't know if you'd ever want to use it to that extreme extent. But if you want something sort of warbly and strange, you could use the spin. Similarly, you could also apply EQ processing to the later reflections, and you could do something. We talked about it for the early reflections. You could do it for the later reflections as well. This is kind of cool.
Trying to figure this out, baby. Trying to figure.
So let me turn off spin.
Trying to figure.
Let me actually go to a low cut and do.
Trying to figure this out, baby. I got my ear.
That sounds kind of nice, right? It gives it a nice shimmer. So you're just applying the reverb. You're still letting the reverb come in. You're letting the original sound come in still. So if I have this at 100%, you're still allowing the original sound to come in, but the diffusion network, the later reflections are only acting on the higher frequencies. This chorus is very similar to spin, except it has to do with the later reflections instead of the early reflections. So chorus and spin are very similar in that regard. This is a really cool feature right here. Freeze. Freeze is really cool because let's say you just like the sound of the reverb and you just want to capture that sound. You can just freeze it. Okay? And you can unfreeze it. Does anyone remember how to resample? You guys remember resampling? Now I'll show you an example of how you can use this in the context of resampling. Okay? So we froze the reverb, right? We froze it. Let's resample that so we can actually use it somewhere else. So let's do this. I'll rename this and call this resampling. And then what I'll do is I'll, oops. I want my audio source for this track that I've just created to be resampling. So I want to resample my strange vocal. So I'll rename this my strange vocal. And I have my resampling track right here. Now what I could do is I've frozen this reverb and I want to record this at the same time. Whoops, I want to record enable this. This track is off. It's not for. What's going on here?
Is the freeze dependent on when in the actual audio clip you are? Because maybe you just like hit freeze at the very beginning, and since it was silent at the very beginning.
Ah, yes, I think that's absolutely correct. You're absolutely right. Good find. Okay, so I guess I have to like quickly finagle and go back. I'm gonna record. Let me turn off all the other stuff so that's not playing. Let's try this. Record, let it start recording, freeze. Okay, great. So now I've captured the sound. Right? So now I've contained the sound. So if I wanted to, I could take this sound that I've created. I could, let's create a new instance of Simpler. Create a MIDI track. Right? Should be somewhat familiar to you. Simpler with resampled sound. Okay. So now I'll go to Instruments. I'll go to Simpler. I'll drag the Simpler on there, and then I will drag this audio that I just made here. And now, I basically sampled my reverb, and I can use my reverb, that particular, right? Remember, I can access these different warp modes. I can go to Beats. Right? So that's a lot of information on reverb, but it's a very handy device to sort of use for your tracks. And if we get back to reverb, there's a lot of parameters that you could use. Oh, my microphone's still on, so it's actually it's reverberating me in real time. It's kind of cool. So, any questions on reverb? Try to assimilate this stuff so that you can study it as well. There's a good video on this as well too that I can put up so you can watch it.
So what does the shape do? And I understand pre-delay, but stereo, pre-delay, shape, you can go over.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So shape actually from the shape and chord and scale basically kind of work respectively on early and later reflections. And based on the resource I've been studying, it doesn't have a dramatic difference. It's a very subtle thing. In fact, like the resource that I was looking at, they couldn't even tell the difference themselves. You can kind of check out what it's doing when you're using it. It just basically it just adds, as the help says, it shapes the prominence of early reflections, as well as their overlap with the diffuse sound. With small values, the reflections decay more gradually. With large values, the reflections decay more rapidly. It's very subtle. Scale kind of does something kind of similar. These two values as well. Quite subtle. This is pretty dramatic, actually. This just affects the amount of density in terms of the reflections, how closely packed they are. Scale. It's subtle. It's not like as dramatic as the decay time or the size or all of these other parameters. But the pre-delay, just for those who don't know, is if you refer back to that original graph that we had over here, the pre-delay is like basically the time it takes to get to the first reflection. So if I set this really late, you see how like there's a delay, like it's like trying to figure. So that's kind of an unnaturally high pre-delay. They're suggesting in the help 1 millisecond to 25 milliseconds of pre-delay, right? You might be in a situation where you do want something that's a little bit high. In fact, if you have something that's sort of pumping, sometimes if you know the actual tempo of your song a technique that some people use is to set the pre-delay so high that it's a multiple of the beat that you're working on. So that way, the advantage of setting the pre-delay high is that your original sound still comes through without a lot of reverberant wash. You see how I could hear the attack of my sound, but I didn't hear the reverb right away. There's an advantage to that because then it doesn't kind of muddy up the track. You can hear your original sound. And then if you set this to some value that kind of synchronizes with your tempo of your track, at some sensible, you have to find the right multiple. And this Ableton device might not give you pre-delay values high enough to achieve this, but Pro Tools you can do this. You can actually set it so that like the reverb sets on the 8th note of the following beat, so that it creates space for your attacks, and then the reverberation happens after that. So that is a lot about reverb. I guess it's probably worth just quickly telling you about return tracks. Return tracks. What these are used for, if you've probably seen all these sends, right? You're trying to make sense of all these sends. What these allow you to do is it allows you to send copies of your track to a return track. Essentially, in another DAW, you would basically send to a bus. But here you can't, it's not exposed that way. You're basically sending to a track directly. So what's happening is, if I wanted to, I'm going to delete these return tracks. In fact, the master track is also a return track, which is interesting. I'm going to create a new return track. I'm going to go to Create Return Track. Okay, so I've got a return track right here. And what I can do is I can put a reverb on that return track. So I'm going to go to Plugins. I'm going to go to actually my own audio effects from Ableton, built in. I'm going to go to Reverb. I'm going to drag on a reverb onto this return track. And it got renamed Reverb. And now what's happening is that this track right here is willing to accept copies of other tracks as its input, so that I could send tracks, I could send copies of other tracks onto this track to be processed with reverb. So for instance, the reason that this is useful is that when you're using reverbs, you might want to use the same reverb for all of your tracks. But instead of copying and pasting a reverb onto all of your tracks individually, that costs some computation for your computer. Instead, you can just have one reverb, and you could just send all your tracks to that one track that has the reverb on it. So for instance, if I go to the beginning and just go to loop the very beginning, solo that, turn it off. Right, so let's say I have my this is the bass, I think. This is the synth. I'm just going to rename. This is a good habit to get into. Synth chords, right? This right here. Never did. Okay, so this is the bass right here. And what I want to do is I want to add reverb to the synth chords. No reverb. This is reverb.
How did you add a track that you could send to again? Because that's basically like a bus, right?
Well, a bus. I mean, if we're being really,
this is more like what I was asking about the other day, like with the groups. Like
yeah.
This is more like a bus, though. This is more like what I was talking about.
Yeah, this is a return track. A bus, I mean, if we're being really technical, a bus is like the virtual channel that allows you to go from one track to another, from a track to a return track. So this is like busing. This busing is the process of doing all that. So
right.
It hides the bus. But what you have to do essentially is you have to create a return track. So you have to go create, insert return track. And then what happens is you can put processing on this return track directly.
Does that make a little knob appear when you do it? Like there's one knob for each return track?
Exactly, exactly. So one knob appears for this track. If I created a new return track, let's say I created a new return track, and we haven't talked about track delay, and I want this to be a delay. I can go to Audio Effects, and I can go to Delay. I'll grab a delay. I'll throw it on here. Now I've got a delay, and if I want, I can add delay to all these tracks, and this is the track that's controlling how the delay works. So, for instance, reverb, like this is a convenient way of working with reverb and delay because, for one, you actually don't want to have multiple different reverbs on all these tracks because it confuses the listener. When you're a listener, it's disorienting to have all these different spatial characteristics because a reverb is emulating a space. It's trying to simulate what it would be like to be in a specific environment, whether it be a cathedral hall or whether it be sort of a baseball stadium or whatever you can think of, a small jazz club. If you have a different kind of place for each of your different, if you have a different space for each of your tracks, the listener will think, where am I? Am I in a baseball stadium or am I in a cathedral? Where am I exactly? So it's the best of both worlds. You basically get to apply the same reverb to all of these different tracks and you save on computational power in the process. So if I want to add some reverb to my bass, now there's reverb on my bass. If I want to add reverb to my vocals, I'll get rid of this reverb.
Trying to figure this out, baby, I got my
Now there's reverb on my vocals. Now there's reverb on my chords, right? So now, and another thing is, you should set your reverb dry-wet control to 100% on your return track. Because why not? You're basically sending a portion of it anyway. This is like a dry-wet knob already, right? So just set your dry-wet of the reverb on your return track to be 100% on dry-wet, so that whenever you're sending it to, it's sending it, and then it'll apply all of the reverb to whatever percentage that you're sending it to.
So you could use the return track as input to a sidechain, right? That would be like group. If you wanted to group things together, that would trigger the sidechain.
You could do that. You could do that. The most Ableton-like way of doing that would probably be just selecting a bunch of tracks and then grouping it like so. Command G.
Then using the group as input.
Yeah, exactly. So if, like, for instance, I had, so earlier, if I want to sidechain everything to that.
It almost seems like groups and busing is kind of interchangeable.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, you don't even need to use a return track to do what I just showed you. It's just convenient. You could use a regular audio track and to do what I showed you. But a return track is convenient because it exposes knobs, so you can adjust levels from the track. I guess that is time. I could keep going on, but I'm afraid that I am going to make your brains explode. So I'll continue updating the OneNote. It's difficult. It's getting I'm getting pulled in 1,000 directions. So I'll do my best to update it for everything. I have a basic explanation of compression and reverb. So you can look at that. It's kind of under mixing for some of this stuff. The drum rack stuff, some of the stuff is there, some of the stuff needs to be added, but if you have any questions, of course, let me know. We can always schedule a time to meet over office hours. Like, I'm available right now, but also over Zoom whenever or over email whenever, if you ever get stuck. So looking forward to finishing listening to your tracks, and things sound great so far. Everyone's getting 100%, and so no worries. Just keep being you and keep working on your music, and you'll get those results soon, just my feedback soon, at least at the latest by Thursday, and in the future, hopefully by Tuesday. And yeah, just let me know how I can help you, and I guess, yeah, stick around for any questions.
All right, take care, Professor.
Oh yeah, take care. Thank you.
Professor, actually, I had a question.
Sure. Is this Andy?
This is Paul.
Oh, I got it wrong. All right. Hey, Paul.
Yeah, I just had a question about. Am I echoing?
Oh no, I don't think so. I didn't put a reverb on you.
All right, for the homework, you were saying to use the Soundflower or the VB cable?
Yeah. Are you on Windows or Mac?
I'm on Windows.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, so I set it up, but it was. I don't know. Are you supposed to record like your mic audio with the Soundflower and the VB cable, or what do you use it for?
Well, the idea is you could record stuff from the internet. Like you can record a YouTube video, or you can record like an online synthesizer, or you can record some other flash audio, and then you can pipe that into Ableton, basically. Like you're using it. Yeah, that's basically the general premise of it.
So it's like audio from the computer.
Audio from the computer.
So if I use the Soundflower and then like if I hit a YouTube video and hit record, it would record the audio coming from the YouTube video kind of thing?
Exactly. And unfortunately, yeah, exactly, precisely.
Oh, okay. So plugging in or like using our mic to record audio wouldn't be considered the Soundflower, correct?
It wouldn't be, just because the fidelity wouldn't be as good, and it wouldn't teach you about the routing for that. I'm not as well. Yeah, I mean, I guess since we're here on office hours, I can help you get up to speed on it really quickly if you'd like. Did you already install the stuff?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. If you'd like, if you want to share your screen, I could help you.
Yeah, sure. Oh, you disabled.
Oh, okay. How about you could try now?
Okay. Okay, I'll just show my screen. Share. Can you see my screen?
Sure.
Okay, so let me just set it up real quick then. So, to here. And then we go set this as default. Okay. Oh, and then also when I had it like this, I couldn't hear audio coming from my computer. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, let's take a look. Let's see. When does that breakdown first happen?
Wait, sorry?
So, like, let's go through the steps and see when the audio breaks.
Okay, yeah, sure. So let's see. I think I can hear you now.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay,
and
now,
then,
so it cut out earlier when I said it.
yeah, it's weird. Like, I remember another student had that same issue. Like, it cut out, and then they did it the second time, and it worked. So this seems okay. Then what about? Let's see. What about if you go to preferences for ASIO for all? Did you set the audio preferences for ASIO for all?
This one when I hit. Are you talking about here?
Oh yeah. So go to go to ASIO for all.
Okay, but I won't be able to hear you when I go to it.
I think if we set up the config, can you turn on your webcam, or do you have one?
I don't know. I have a desktop, so it doesn't have a camera.
Oh, gotcha. All right. So this might be a little difficult, but I guess I might. You know what? Let me actually control your. I'll just request.
Okay. Yeah. Sure.
Request remote control. Okay. Okay, great. So, and then if you can't hear me, you could. We'll cross that bridge when we get there. Let's.
Okay.
Because I was able to. The second time we did this, my student was able to hear me. So right now you might be in a situation where you can't hear me, or maybe you can. So I'm taking it that you did all this stuff. Okay, so I guess I'll just disable all this stuff right now. And you've already set VB cable as your input, I guess. Let's see if you did or not. What is that? An audio, oh, right here. Open sound settings, speakers, cable. Virtual cable. And what we want is input to be that, and we want the output to be that. I think that'll do something. And then I guess you're in 44. All of these seem to be the same sample rate. Oh, actually, some of these seem to be 48 kilohertz. So maybe I'll set your sample. I guess we'll change this to that. We'll change this to 48K just for fun. Why not? Hardware setup. It's funny because last time my student was able to get this to work. The first time they weren't with the Zoom audio, because I presume you're talking, but you can't hear. I can't hear you at all, but it's okay for now. Input, output. I guess we can test to see if the YouTube playback works. So if we go to, well, I guess theoretically this part should work now. If we go Control T, and then it should be channels 1 through 2. And if we go to YouTube, and then we just click a random video, and then we check this out. Oops, wrong shortcut, my bad. And then we go to Ableton. It should be playing. Good. Go to Ableton. We record enable this, and we set it to auto. And we set the preferences right. Let's see. Control, comma, hardware setup should be input, VB cable, 24 bits. Doesn't seem like any audio is getting rendered for whatever reason. If I just record. Is there anything that I record? Looks like nothing is getting recorded. This is up all the way. Sound settings. Looks like volume is going to cable input. Let's try this. Exit out of Ableton. Do you mind if I guess I'll save this? Maybe you could click yes if you want to. Is it cool to save it? You can save it. Paul, you can control the screen. Oh, you just did. Okay, cool. All right, so I guess we'll open up Ableton again. Live 10. Let's see if that had anything to do with some weird ASIO setting. Okay, great. So for all hardware setup, input, output. Doesn't seem to be bouncing or detecting any audio, which is weird. Because it is detecting it here. I don't think that should change it at all. World. Oh, looks like some stuff changed. Maybe that's the problem. Let's see. Settings.